Again, welcome. We're so happy that you're here. You know, this past Wednesday, as I mentioned, it was Ash Wednesday, and we had a wonderful worship, really just kicking off this series with an introduction message about what we would be talking about over the next 5 weeks. And again, this is the season of Lent, those 40 days before Easter and Holy Week. And so if you have not yet started the Forgiving Challenge book, that's okay. You can still pick one up. You can still get caught up. Today, you should be on day 5, not page 5, day 5, right? It's day 5 of Lent, so that's how it correlates. And the sermon that you're about to hear, it's covering what you will be reading this coming week. So that's where we're going, and just so you guys know. The good news is for anyone who did not pick up a book, or if you're not planning to pick up a book, these messages will still reflect some of the things that are in the book. And so you'll be caught up that way, and we'll all be a part of this together. But this past Wednesday, we were introduced to 5 phases that lead to freedom. And we're using the acronym SCARS, which I think is just so great for the season of Lent in particular. But that acronym, it stands for sin, right? Confession, absolution, restoration, and sanctification. A lot of churchy words that we're going to break down together as we go on this journey. And today we're looking at that first word. That word is sin. And each week we'll advance one phase, one word. But the sin word, well, it's a pretty loaded word, if I'm being honest with you guys. And we're going to dive into it today and what it really means. But first in this series, we'll be looking at how Jesus forgives Peter. Specifically, how he does it in John chapter 1. So today, or John chapter 21, I want to introduce you to Peter today and the sin that Peter is most known for as well. We know a lot about Peter in the Bible. In fact, he's referred to almost 200 times in the New Testament, and that's 5 times more than any of the other 12 disciples. Take John, for instance. I believe he's only referenced somewhere between 31, 32 times in the New Testament. Then you have Peter, 200 times. So at the first moment that we're introduced to Peter, he actually goes by a different name, doesn't he? Anybody know what that name was? Yeah, Simon. Simon, he's on a boat, he's fishing. This was the family business, this was his call, and by all means, this was his future as well. And in Matthew's gospel, Jesus, he addresses Peter first as Simon, son of Jonah. And then immediately, without having to do anything to earn a new name, Jesus declared that Simon will now be Cephas, or translated to Peter, which means rock or big boulder. And I like the fact that Jesus changed his name before Peter had to do anything to earn it. Many times we get it wrong and we think that for God to love us, for God to accept us, right, or to help us even, that we must first prove to him that we're worthy of his love and in his acceptance. Some of us will go our whole lives fighting for God's approval. But what you need to see from the beginning is that you don't need to do anything to make God love you. He just does. He already does. And maybe you think you're not special enough for Jesus to call someone like you. Even if Peter didn't do anything noteworthy, right, to receive this new identity. Certainly, Peter was of high class in his social realm, right, in the world. Wrong. No, he totally wasn't. And the more you look at Peter's story, there really wasn't all that much that would have stood out. There's a pastor by the name of Pastor Adam Hamilton. He wrote a book that's called Simon Peter, Flawed but Faithful Disciple. And he said once about Peter, he said, in the Jewish population, there was a class of people going back hundreds of years before the time of Jesus and Peter, and they were called Am Haaretz. Am Haaretz, and it's a Hebrew word. And the phrase literally means the people of the land. And the term has a very interesting history, but by the time of Peter, it meant people who were poor, uneducated, lower class, particularly people who were not careful in their observance of the law. And in Acts 4, it describes Peter as an unschooled and ordinary man. And yet here we have, through this ordinary, unschooled man, a person who would become Petros, right, in the Greek. Peter, again, the rock, the right-hand man of Jesus. See, just as God, he saw something in Peter, he sees something in all of us as well. Jesus sees what you can be, regardless of what you've done or what other people have said about you, even. One of the most popular TV shows out there for more than a decade has been The Voice. Raise your hand. You seen The Voice? Anybody like The Voice? Yeah, I like it as well. It's a singing competition that has a very unique twist with it. In most singing shows before this, it really depended how cool someone looked or how vibey they were with you, right? It didn't always matter if their voice was actually better than the next person. Well, not on The Voice, because the judges, they can't see the contestants. In the blind audition round, the judges, they're seated in these big red chairs with their backs facing the contestants. And if the judge likes what they hear after the contestants start singing, they hit this big red button. And the button makes their chairs turn around, and the big neon light at the bottom of the chairs, what does it say? I want you. That means the judge is picking the contestant, sight unseen, to be on his or her team. The quality of the voice was enough to get one of the top musical talents in the world to commit to being their personal coach. You know, Pastor Stephen Furtick, he writes about this show in his book called Crash the Chatterbox. And I'm in agreement with what he says about this in particular. He declares that it's in the blind audition round that's the best part of the show. It makes for the best TV. He says it's intense to see somebody singing their heart out for a panel of judges who may not choose them, and they can't even see them. Sometimes all four judges will turn their chairs around, and the likes and musical legends like Usher and Blake Shelton and John Legend, Gwen Stefani, Kelly Clarkson, depending on whatever season you watch, they start arguing over who gets to be the next coach, right? Next thing you know, there's a full-blown debate about who discovered the next big thing. And it's so strange to me to see these musical giants fighting over who gets to work with this previously unknown aspiring artist. But the craziest thing to see from time to time is when no chairs turn around. That's just downright depressing, isn't it? Nobody's choosing this person. No lights are shining on them. The message is clear. Nobody wants you. You go home. Rejected. And, you know, I think that most of us would go through our lives like these contestants sometimes, through these blind auditions, just waiting on someone to hit a button, auditioning our hearts out for acceptance and approval. And all the judges that we've appointed are sitting in chairs that we've furnished in our minds, right? And we have to get them to turn around somehow, to do something, to say something, to prove something to someone. The panel of judges, it varies from person to person, right? But our driving motivation is the same. We're trying to escape this self-inflicted prison of insecurity. And we need these people to say something or do something that will get us out. Maybe for some of you, it's your parents that are in that seat. Maybe for some of you, it's a boss at your workplace. When will they notice me? Give me the approval, the promotion that I deserve. For our youth, maybe it's the cool kids, right? At school, waiting on that invitation for the party. Waiting Friday night just to get a text that invites you to go do something. Thinking that everything would change if you get that. If they would just notice me, if they would just compliment me, tell me that I have what it takes, just hit the button. And what's sad about this is none of these people even have a button to hit. And sometimes, even if they did, they wouldn't even press it. And so what I want you to see today is that there's one who's seated on a different chair, a throne in heaven. He's in a chair, and it's the only chair that counts. And he's already declared that I want you. The only one that has the power to truly give us his approval has already given it to us fully and freely. And this is not just true of Peter, but we can go back to Psalm 139, and it tells us so intimately how God, he knows us as our creator. I want you to just sit back and listen to these words about how much God delights in you and knows you. For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place, when I was woven together in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed body, and all the days ordained for me were written in your book before even one of them came to be. You don't get to know somebody much better than that. And that's what God is telling you today. I know you better than you know yourself. Before you did anything, God, he set his sights on you. He gives you a new identity. He sees something in you. And so may you hear today from heaven that before you were born, before you breathed, before you had an opportunity to show off or to screw up, God declared that I love you. You're mine. I've chosen you, and you belong to me. So put it this way, God has issued an announcement from his throne in heaven that he wants you and that the audition has been canceled. He's not chosen you blindly, but intentionally, even while knowing you inwardly and intimately, knowing what your past has been and where you are now and what you will do in your future, even knowing the best that you will bring and knowing the worst that you've brought. God says, I want you. If this God has chosen you while totally knowing the worst parts of you, then you no longer have to live up to anyone or anything that this world might throw at you. It's an important lesson for us to remember today. But even after receiving grace and a new identity in Jesus, there's still times where we fail to live up to the name that God, he places on us, isn't there? Pastor Hamilton, who I quoted earlier, he says, how could Jesus call Simon a rock? After all, this man is going to blow it consistently. He will be less like a rock and more like a reed or a blade of grass, easily moved, swayed, and broken. He will miss the point again and again. After Jesus called Peter to be his disciple, the text says that immediately Peter followed Jesus. And this is the kind of guy that Peter was, right? He was an all-in type of guy. Peter, he became the outspoken leader of the disciples. And in any list or story that you hear about these disciples, Peter's name is always, it seems, to be mentioned first. He was a natural-born leader that was never afraid to really speak his mind or to make a big move. In fact, Peter, in one of his most famous stories, right, he's actually the only disciple who had the courage to step out of a boat and walk on water just for a little bit, right, as he kept his focus on Jesus. There was a day when Peter, he really lived up to his name as well. You see, tensions were growing and rising quickly because Jesus and the Jewish leaders of that day didn't see eye to eye. Jesus was performing all these miracles, and they saw that as a threat. And so Jesus, he takes this opportunity to take his disciples aside. And we heard this last week in our message on the Transfiguration, and we're going to go back to that real quick in Matthew 16. It says, when Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked the disciples, who do the people say that the Son of Man is? And they replied, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. And so Jesus says, but what about you, he asked. Who do you say that I am? Simon Peter answered, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Jesus, he replied, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. It's in this exchange where Peter, he gets it so right. On this confession of Peter that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, Jesus assures him that he will build his church. And not only that, but on this confession, but also using Peter, he will grow his church after his resurrection. He will use him as an apostle and a disciple in the years to come after the resurrection to grow his church. So in just a few short years after answering the call to be a disciple, now Peter had become Jesus' right-hand man. And we know that there were 12 disciples, right? But there's also what we would call an inner three. Those that really had this access to Jesus. And there were Peter, James, and John. And they got more access, and it seems like they were invited to some special opportunities. But simply put, there may be no human in history of the world that Jesus had believed in and trusted, empowered, and given personal access to like he did Peter. So now with all that background, Peter, we fast forward and he's dining around the table at the Last Supper with Jesus. And Jesus declares that not only will one of the disciples betray him, which will lead directly to his crucifixion, but another disciple will deny even knowing him. And so Peter, he stands up and he boldly declares, even if all fall away on account of you, I never will. A statement that you would expect from a rock, right? Peter's not afraid to be outspoken. If anyone should be the guy to never fall away, it should have been Peter. I love Peter. I really do. I relate to him. But even in a bold statement to try to say the right thing, he has a way of throwing all of his friends under the bus. Did you catch that? Even if everyone else in the room falls away, God, I never will. And so Jesus, he answers back. He says, truly, I tell you, this very night before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. And Peter declared, even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you." And all the disciples said the same. See, Peter doubles down. He says, "I'll die before I deny." I'll die before I deny. And it's an interesting phrase, though, that section ends with. All the other disciples said the same. Because the last I checked, it's Peter who gets the bad rap for this, right, in the denial. But you see, that's what happens to leaders often of the time. They get the blame and they get the cameras on them. And even when others that are on their team make the mistake as well. But nevertheless, Peter, the outspoken disciple, is the one that's known for his denial. His denials are captured in all four Gospels. And we're going to look at it from Luke's perspective today, in Luke chapter 22. It says, "Then seizing Jesus, they led him away and took him to the house of the high priest. Peter followed at a distance, and when some there had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and had sat down together, Peter sat down with them. A servant girl saw him seated there in the firelight. She looked closely at him and said, 'This man was with them.' But he denied it. Said, 'Woman, I don't know him,' he said. A little later, someone else saw him and said, 'You are also one of them.' 'Man, I am not,' Peter replied. About an hour later, another asserted, 'Certainly this fellow was with them, for he's Galilean.' And Peter replied, 'Man, I don't know what you're talking about.' And just as he was speaking, the rooster crowed." And this is the part here that gets me. The Lord turned and looked straight at Peter in this moment. And then Peter remembered the words that the Lord had spoken to him. "Before the rooster crows today, you will disown me 3 times. And he went out and he wept bitterly." How many times in your life have you made that same kind of promise to God? "God, just give me another chance. Promise this time it's going to be different. God, if you just give me this one more chance, I promise I won't fail you this time." Right? We've all been there. We've all done it. And you relate to Peter on such a deep level with this, because he looks at Jesus at the Lord's Supper and he says, "I'll die before I deny." Looks him in the eyes. And then, without even really knowing it, because of just his human condition of sin, he denies him 3 times. And it says immediately Jesus locks eyes with him again. And oh, the hurt that Peter would have felt in this moment. Peter, the rock, Jesus' right-hand man, had flat out denied Jesus at a time when Jesus needed him most. At a time when his friend and his Savior and his teacher and his Lord needed his faithfulness most, he denied Jesus. Not once, not twice, but as the King James Version would say, thrice, right? 3 times. And what's striking to me is the lack of courage in Peter in this moment. Peter was the one that jumped out of the boat. He was the one that would speak up and make bold proclamations from time to time. And that makes you feel like he would have been able to stand up to anything or anybody or any peer pressure that he faced. And here he is at this first denial, warming his hand by a fire, crumbling in front of a little servant girl. Sometimes, even with the best of intentions, the weight of this world, it falls upon us, and sadly, we make decisions that in the moment they may feel good, but eventually they leave us feeling empty. And this is ultimately what sin does. It fills us in the moment, but it leaves us empty. Peter sinned badly. We just read about it. And as we said in the beginning, sin can be a very loaded term today. And one of the most offensive things that you can say to someone in this world is, "You're a sinner," right? But why is it so offensive? I think if people knew what it really meant, it might not be so shocking. In the book this week, you're going to read about how Pastor Zender, he talks about the term sin coming from an old archery term, meaning to miss the mark. If bullseye is the mark, anything outside of bullseye is sin. That means all the times I used to throw darts in my parents' house and I would hit the wall instead of the board, that's sin, right? It's outside of the bullseye. If the bullseye's the target, I may hit it every now and then, but more often than not, I miss. And it feels like an impossible standard to attain and to hit it every time. We live in a world and in a culture today that likes to tell everybody that they're good just the way that they are. We celebrate everyone's uniqueness, and that's okay to a point. We encourage them. We say, "No, you do you, man. You be you, girl," right? And we're taught to fully affirm everyone. And there's a problem with this, and it's simple. It's just that we're all sinful. Every one of us missed the mark, and the worst thing that we could do for one another is pretend like we're perfect. And this is where it can get difficult. If sin is missing the mark, then those who haven't signed up to follow Jesus have a different idea of what that mark actually is. And we can't always expect non-Jesus followers to live to those standards or those marks that we pursue. And I'm not saying that others, the way that they live is right, or any other standard that's other than Jesus is right, but sometimes we get in trouble as Christians to try to hold accountable those who never signed up to follow Jesus and the standards of Jesus. And that's where it gets a little muddy. But I think, honestly, if you were to talk to somebody who didn't follow Jesus, and even if they didn't measure up to Christian standards, if they're honest with themselves, and if you're honest with yourself, you have your own standards, right? Your own marks, and you fail to live up to them. They have their own standards, and they fall short of those as well. If you're like me, you've been trying to become a better version of yourself maybe for decades now. You thought maybe you wouldn't be struggling with the same sin that you were when you were a teenager. After all these years, you're like, why am I still going through this, God? I'd be hard-pressed to find anyone in life that has lied to me or been more disappointed in me than myself. And there's a twisted version of reality that I think if I just keep getting better, if I just keep moving and becoming wealthier and get a better job, that everything will be great. But let me tell you that the best version of yourself will never be good enough to get you into heaven. And quite frankly, it won't even fully satisfy you. The version of yourself in your head with the perfect body and the huge bank account and the giant house and the white picket fence and the kids who are leading the National Honor Society, it will not complete you. You will find something new about yourself that you don't like. Why? Because you're sinful. I'm sinful. And the last thing that we should do for one another, and when we gather as a church family and worship, is be fake and act like we are fully put together. I talked with a couple weeks ago, and I got their permission to use this story, but they got out of the car. I was outside on the deck, and I saw them get out of the car, and it looked like they had had a tough morning. And I was talking with them about it, and they said that they got into a fight on the way to church, which never happens, right? No one ever gets into a fight on the way to church. And I was talking with them. They said, but as soon as we got out of the car and got my tie ready and I hugged my wife and I kissed my kids, we put on this mask and we faked it. And I said, well, if you don't want to fight on the way to church, right, the only thing that you can really do, and I was looking at the husband, and I said, go to 4 years of seminary, get up 3 hours early before everybody in your family, and then get to church and you won't fight, right? So that was my answer. I was just joking with him, but it's true, right? I mean, I've been around church long enough to know that we have some serious issues that we bring in with us. Rather than stuffing them, let's see them for what they are, and let's bring them to the one that can actually do something about them. Amen? And so as we look at scars, one of the first things that we need to do is we need to get down into the wound and let it ultimately heal, and to rip off the Band-Aid of sin. The Band-Aid that says, no, I'm good the way that I am. No, you're not. And we need to get under that Band-Aid to figure out what it is that's really going on. Look, I can see the Band-Aid on you, and I'm sure you can see the big Band-Aid that's on me as well. Let's stop trying to hide it. Let's admit that we're sinners in need of God's grace. The book this week, you'll read that it says the admission price into freedom, it begins with your admission of sins, and that is so true. Today, we have what we're calling the Admit One bookmarks, and I encourage you to pick one up. It's a great way to keep with your readings, as it has a calendar on there for you. But it's the Admit One bookmark where you can put your name, and it will remind you of this truth, that I'll never be free if I can't admit my weakness, my mistakes, and the ways that I have missed the mark. If you think I'm being hard on you, or I'm picking on you this morning, I'll start by saying what Pastor Zinder said. Hi, my name is Stephen, and I am a sinner. I've missed the mark terribly at times, with lust, greed, pride, wrongful comparisons. There's times where I've been harsh and unmerciful. But the last thing I want from you is for you to accept me the way that I am, as this is my best self for today. Please don't do that. And why would you, right? Now, I'm not saying you got to be mean to me either. One of my love languages is words of affirmation, so don't totally just write me off here. But it's good to affirm the good parts, but in totality, please don't, right? Because I'm not okay with who I am today, and I do want to get better. And that's not because I'm trying to work my way to heaven. It's because I want to get better for God. I want to use my life in the greatest way possible so that God can use it to connect more people to Him. And after all that God has done for me, I hope that today's version of me isn't the best that it gets. And I pray that's your prayer as well. I want to keep growing. I want to keep getting better, to continue to get more effective, because I want to give my best to a God who's given me His best continually. And so the worst thing that you could do for me is tell me I'm perfect just the way that I am. It sounds nice, but it's a lie from Satan. I love you too much to tell you that this is the best you that you can be. And I hope you love me too much to settle for the version that's in front of you. So here's the truth. God's love for you, or God loves you for who you are, but His love, it doesn't leave you just as you are. God's love, it will change you. And many of us would question how in the world Peter could deny Jesus after all that Jesus had done for him and invested in him and trusted into him. And the same could be said for us. Because Jesus has done it for you too. He's invested in you. He didn't just die on a cross for Peter, but He died on a cross for each and every one of us here today. He's entrusted the kingdom to you, to me, to this church, His representation. And yet, through our words and our actions and maybe our inaction, sometimes we completely fail Him at times. So hopefully we will learn to sit in the sin of Peter. And we'll learn to sit in our sin as well. And this week, while we're looking at our sin, next week we'll turn to confession. And we'll bring those sins to God. And I promise you, next week it's going to be one of the most powerful experiences that I think you've ever been a part of. I pray that's the case. But today, let's sit in our sin. And you might be saying, Stephen, this is church. This is uncomfortable. You're not supposed to get in my business like this. You're not supposed to bring this sin to light. Says who? Right? I'm your pastor. And the metaphor that comes up most for a pastor, and even we'll see for Peter, is shepherd. Christ is the good shepherd. And then He places under shepherds beneath Him that keep leading the sheep. And King David, he declares in the Psalms that all of us like sheep have gone astray. And it's not a compliment, guys. It's not a compliment. Sheep are not the wisest animals in the world. They're dumb. And they absolutely rely on the shepherd's leadership. But I need you to know that before I'm a shepherd, I am a sheep as well. I have to sit at the feet of Jesus every morning. I've been bad, and you've been bad, but somehow, some way, God has put me here to shepherd and to keep putting Jesus in front of you and bringing you back to Him and reminding you of His goodness. We need this message together. And so today, what I want you to see is that God has chosen you. Not because of your actions, not because of what you have done or what you will do, but because He loves you. And if you decide to pursue Jesus, you will still have times where you fall short, where you fail Him. But it's what you do in those failures and in those mistakes and in those sins that make all the difference. And that's where we're moving in this series. And next week, I believe it's going to be so powerful. The first step to freedom is to see your need for it. And that's what today's all about. And to repeat an earlier phrase, the admission price into freedom begins with your admission of sin. But one last piece before I leave you for the week. And we heard this on Ash Wednesday as well. Any failure is simply an opportunity to fall into the grace of Jesus once again. While sin ends many stories in this world, God, He doesn't write stories that end in sin. God doesn't write stories that end badly. No, He will ensure that He will do everything that He can to keep writing new chapters. And that final chapter for all of us, whenever that day comes, it ends in grace for you. We talked on Ash Wednesday about John chapter 21. It's the last chapter in John, and it's the last chapter of all the gospel. So you add all the gospel chapters up, it's the 89th chapter. And we're really going to dive into that next week. But today, I just want to share with you the first 4 words of this incredible chapter where Jesus will forgive and He will restore and He will love Peter so beautifully and so carefully and so specifically. The first 4 words make all the difference. Are you ready for them? Afterwards, Jesus appeared again. Afterwards, Jesus appeared again. Sin should end your story and my story, but we have a God who will keep appearing. When it appears your story over, Jesus will appear again and again and again. You are not done because God's not done. with you. And the only way that we can be free is because we have a God who initiates. You see, God is not afraid of sin. God is not afraid of the wounds that we've caused. And we have a God who will enter in, even if it cost him his son's life. And even after giving his life, if that wasn't enough, he will keep showing up and he will keep being near to us because that's his promise. He loves us and he invites us into this relationship with him freely. And God, even after calling and believing and trusting and investing in us, he can demonstrate his love in the midst of sin. And he can continue to rescue us time and time again. How great is our God that we serve. Afterward, Jesus appeared again. Afterward, Jesus appeared again. Say it with me this time. Afterward, Jesus appeared again. Rip off the Band-Aid and let Jesus in this week. In his name, amen.